Welcome to the second TAPAS seminar series. So as you probably all know, TAPAS is a network on tackling air pollution in schools. And we welcome anyone who would like to join. I think Sophie can add our website to the chat just in case. And I would like to remind you this meeting will be recorded. So if you do not wish to be recorded, then please do keep your camera and microphone turned off. Do feel free to put any questions you have during the talk in the chat and I'll read them out at the end. And also, if you could keep your microphones off and your cameras off while the talk is happening, that would be great. We can save everyone's internet connections. So I'm very pleased to introduce Mike Holland, and he'll be speaking today about prioritising actions. So addressing issues of prioritisation for improving air quality in schools. So like which schools to target, about identification of risks and evaluation of measures using cost effectiveness and other measures. And he is co-lead of Focus Area 3, which appropriately enough is prioritization of actions in TAPAS, and he's also a freelance consultant. He has 35 years of experience working on air pollution impact assessment. Clients include DEFRA and the UK government agencies, governments in several other countries, the NHS Sustainable Development Unit, EC, WHO, OECD, and the World Bank. He's a member of the Committee on the Medical Effects of Air Pollutants, an independent expert on the social economic analysis to DEFRA's Chemical Stakeholders Forum. I'm sure he'll have a very interesting talk for us today. Mike, please feel free to start whenever you're ready.
Yeah, thank you, Megan, and good afternoon to everyone. Much of my work is around environmental economics. Economics, of course, known to many as the devil's work. I hope to disabuse some of you, at least, of that view during this talk. Something I want to make clear is that there's not really a standard recipe for prioritising actions. In some quarters, there are methods such as cost effectiveness analysis that really dominate the prioritisation process. But I think as far as TAPAS and air pollution in schools go, the situation really demands something beyond that straight economics treatment. So I'm going to be trying to sort of discuss issues around that over the next half hour or so. When thinking about prioritisation, there's a load of questions that you can come up with, not least why schools, which I'll come to in a moment, but do we focus on technical or behavioural measures? Which effects should we be considering? How do we rate priorities and so on? So there's a whole bunch of questions out there. So we start off with quite a complicated picture, and I think the prioritisation process needs to do its best to simplify these issues and take people through the process step by step. One thing I want to mention right at the start is there is potential here for misallocation of resource, and there's several pressures that could lead to misallocation. We've got a lot of well-motivated parents, pupils, teachers wanting action to be taken. So there's a pressure there, and if they're not getting the right advice, there is potential there for misallocation. There's also in schools. I mean, thinking back to my own time as a school governor, and if the same applies now as did then, there's pressure on spending budgets at the end of the school year that can sometimes lead to rather inefficient use of the money that's available. There's also a lot of people out there promoting different products with yeah, generally with the best of intentions, but not always seeing the benefits of alternative approaches to seeing to improving air quality in schools. So again, that needs to be taken into account. And then of course there's variability in the needs of schools. So one size is not going to fit all in this case. If you compare, for example, the situation of a brand new school in the middle of a highly polluted urban area versus a Victorian building, a Victorian school building in a rural area, there's clearly different needs associated with those different schools. So in any prioritisation process, we have to be able to recognise that those differences exist. I'm going to deal, going back to my set of questions here, these with, first of all, why schools, and then which kind of schools might we wish to prioritise on in TAPAS. Basically, where should we have started our prioritisation process? Should we have looked at indoor air quality in homes or in institutions, and for institutions, in addition to schools, we might have looked at hospitals and care homes as well. So there were options to be made at that point. I think what attracts me to schools and what makes me think we made the right decision in TAPAS to focus on schools is that we know we've got a sensitive population in schools. We also know that in many schools there's a motivated population of pupils, teachers and parents who will be willing to work with us to take this forward. And once we've done the work on schools, of course, lessons that we've learned there can be used in other settings. So I think picking schools in the first place was the right priority. I think there are other complications with other settings that are more problematic than ones with schools. Then there's a question of, are we focusing on the right schools? Noting, for example, variation in poverty and child health around the UK. There is a logic there for focusing on schools perhaps that are more deprived and in more polluted areas. For pilot activities, however, I think that in addition to schools with identifiable problems, we really need schools that are expressing an interest in this. We need to really get them on board from the start, and the schools that are most willing to do that may well be the ones that push the TAPAS work ahead most. And for later rollout, I think that there could be prioritisation, perhaps recognising with respect to monitored pollution levels, either indoor or outdoor pollution levels, prioritisation reflecting deprivation index, prioritisation reflecting a type of building, etc. But I think that level of prioritisation, I think, comes up in a different stage to the one we're at the moment. So then we move on to, I think, the big question of what we're trying to achieve, which leads into what we should be measuring, what effects we should be concerned with, and so on. And I think we'd all agree in TAPAS that we're seeking to improve the school environment. We want to gain the most benefit for the available resource. And we also want to do it quickly. If we all accept that there is an air pollution problem in the country, we don't want to be involved in research that takes many years to actually come to fruition and do something useful. We want to be getting the answers out there as quickly as we can. Also, fairly obviously, we want to be avoiding harm. That's not always so easy to do. And I'll come to that in a minute. First of all, talking about the benefits of actions. Benefits through reduced pollution, kind of an means to an end rather than perhaps a benefit in its own right. We want benefits in terms of improved health, possibly reduced absenteeism, possibly improved educational attainment, possibly influences on behaviour in the classroom, and no doubt you could add other benefits to this list. So I think when dealing with prioritisation, we do need to sort of recognise a broad range of benefits. If you focus on one particular aspect in that list, or something else you might wish to add to it, there is a danger that you're not seeing the full picture. You might be focusing on the wrong thing. So in terms of prioritisation, it's key, I think, to be drawing up pretty comprehensive lists of the benefits of actions that might be taken. I mentioned not doing harm, and there are a range of harms that can be done, often very inadvertently. One group is bringing pollutants into the school, either in cleaning products, in building products, in furniture and furnishings. So there's a need there to actually understand what is coming into the schools. We don't want to be recommending, I mean, it would be strange to be recommending one series of interventions in the schools to improve air quality and ignoring other things that schools are doing, such as buying these products, sort of counteracts the measures that we're recommending to be introduced. Other possible harms, and this is linked more specifically to measures that could be introduced. Some of them will increase energy use, some of them might make buildings unfriendly, less easy to use. Some of them might waste resource in other ways, for example, installing expensive measures when a cheaper version would do. So there are a number of sort of possible harms out there. In saying that, I think it's important to recognise that many of the measures that we deal with aren't burden-free. So many of them might use energy, they might generate wastes such as filters or liquid wastes. Some of them might bring in substances such as PFAS, perfluorinated alkyl substances, that there's certainly a lot of current interest in. These are the forever chemicals that have been mentioned a lot in the press in recent months. They are commonly found in insulation, in heat pumps and air conditioning systems, etc. And then using alternative materials, those materials might have properties that may not be so good for environmentally friendly goods as they are for the goods that are producing air pollutants. So when we're bringing in measures, we need to recognise that they may have negative aspects as well as positive aspects. And the important thing there is understanding the pros and cons. I wouldn't immediately rule out any option because it uses more energy or whatever, but I think it's important to understand that is actually going on. And by understanding that, it gives you the potential to go and investigate better options that perhaps use energy more efficiently, or to include something like energy efficiency in the standards that you might set, that the criteria you might set down for selection of an option. Understanding of those issues also might direct you to use a different option in the first place that is overall better. But overall, putting those things together, this is about making informed choices. So, balancing any negative aspects with the positives that are available. There's actually quite a sort of broad, it's quite a broad area of work in terms of climate change assessments, where the there's a lot of effort going into characterising so-called co-benefits. Less less effort going into identifying and dealing with the sort of trade-offs that I've got listed here. But it's, as I say, in other areas of work, this is reasonably well developed and reasonably well understood. So I think useful to roll in here as well. How do we measure the benefits of improved air quality in schools? There can be, we could take a very simple approach to this. We could focus on pollutant monitoring, for example, and take that as our sort of main criteria. Problem there is that we're dealing with several pollutants, so instantly the situation is more complex. We might look at some issues, absenteeism, either through, particularly through sick leave, might be related to air quality in schools. Use of asthma medication in schools, again, could be related to air quality in schools. Also educational attainment. I'm particularly struck by several papers that prior to last year I hadn't been aware of, but there seems to be a lot of interest from chess players and people organising chess tournaments in air quality. And part of this is related to CO2, part of it's also related to fine particulate matter, as shown there. So what they're finding in those studies is evidence for pollution levels affecting the concentration of the chess players. So yeah, that seems to me something that could well be carried through into the classroom, irrespective of whether people are playing chess or not. So it could have influences on educational attainment. In terms of measuring that, perhaps asking staff in the schools about the interaction between the two would be useful. Staff, for example, could monitor pupil attentiveness, etc., over time, and that could be correlated perhaps with pollution levels. So yeah, I think it's a interesting additional area that could be explored, and there may be other measures out there as well. But I think there's, as I say, there's a broad set of possible benefits that could be measured, and I think are sort of worthy of consideration for demonstrating, sort of picking out how one might prioritise actions taken to improve air quality in the schools. Final sort of point on this, what are we trying to achieve area, is just highlighting that word quickly. And as I said at the start, if we recognise this as a problem, then it is something we ought to get ahead with, get on and sort out with some sense of urgency. I stress this because I think in a lot of air pollution work, there's an emphasis on doing ever more research rather than actually thinking how it might be used. That kind of kicks the can down the road. If we think there's a problem, we need to get ahead and deal with it. Going on to measures now, and considering some of the costing issues that arise. Important to understand when we're talking about buying any kit or whatever, the full range of costs. So it's pretty easy to obtain information on purchase prices. It gets more difficult when it comes to installation costs, to find out how much it will cost to get things up and running. And then also we need information on running costs. We need to know what the servicing is going to cost. We need to know what the repair costs are likely to be over time. We need to know what the other sort of standard running costs are, electricity, etc. Possibly new filters and so on. So important when we're talking about costs that we're covering the full range of factors there. Repair is a difficult one because it's not something that ever seems to pop up in the information I see on costs. So perhaps if we can't get a direct cost for that, some indication of the reliability of equipment over time would be useful to factor into decision-making processes. But you know, whatever, I think you need that full set of information on costs before you can start to prioritise using costs as one of the elements in the equation. The standard approach in environmental economics to costing measures is to use things called marginal abatement costs, and I've got one here. This looks horribly complicated, but there are far more complex versions of this out in the world. This is a cost curve. It's actually from China, I've just noticed, but it's a cost curve for abating CO2. This isn't specifically for schools. This is for the wider economy. I think for the energy sector, but the same applies to other sectors as well. So what we have on the x-axis is the CO2 abatement potential in grams per, in this example, in grams per kilowatt hour of electricity, but it could just be the you could express this in different ways. You could express this relative to the concentration of pollutants in a classroom, for etc. And on the y-axis we have what's called the marginal abatement cost. And what this is showing on the left-hand side, we see a number of measures whose marginal abatement cost is below zero. Those measures will cost you, save you money. And then we have a number of measures from just left of centre off to the right-hand side with costs above the zero line. So these things will cost you money as opposed to the money-saving measures on the left-hand side. The width of the bars shows how much pollution is abated by each measure. So it's telling you something about the extent of pollution abatement, and it's telling you something about the costs for each of those measures. Now, the obvious thing to do in the first instance, once you've got a cost curve like this, is to focus on the measures on the left-hand side, either the ones that save you money, largely by improved efficiency, and hence reduced energy use, or the ones that don't cost you very much per the sort of the lower cost options with only slightly positive costs. It would be fairly dumb to sort of prioritize anything on the right hand side that is more expensive. You want to get the cheaper stuff done first, fairly obviously. So this is a standard approach to prioritizing measures for pollution abatement. But the marginal abatement cost curves, like the one I've just shown, do have a number of problems. They don't ever seem to account for uncertainty at all. And in the case of schools, you know, there's clear uncertainty. There's clear variability in the extent to which any individual measure will reduce pollution levels, reflecting, you know, the design of the school, for example. They also provide a rather one-dimensional view of benefit, so they tend to pick on one particular sort of characteristic. So in that version, they're only looking at CO2 abatement potential. They're not factoring in other pollutants. SO2, NOx, fine particles that would be abated by some of these same measures. So taking this very one-dimensional view. And furthermore, coverage of behavioural issues is very scant in the marginal abatement cost curves. And that is, I think, largely a reflection of the difficulty that people drawing up those curves have in accounting for uncertainty. The behavioural measures do tend to vary quite extensively in the extent to which a particular measure will have benefits ranging from place to place. So as you take a measure from one place to another place, its benefits will vary depending on population density and all sorts of other factors. Whereas for the very technical measures, the benefits tend to be far more predictable. So you know, those are some of the issues with MAC curves. They are useful. But they have their limitations, and I think in coming up with recommendations and a prioritisation under TAPAS, we need to be bearing those sorts of issues into taking those into account. So with that in mind, it's useful, I think, to think beyond this cost effectiveness MAC curve approach. A lot of my own work deals with cost benefit analysis, and that has some advantages over cost effectiveness analysis in that you can factor in a very wide range of benefits into the assessment. However, it also requires that you are able to monetize benefits. And I think as far as TAPAS is concerned, monetization of many of the benefits that we're dealing with would be extremely difficult and massively debatable. So I think heading down the cost benefit analysis route is not likely to sort of take us in a direction that would be hugely useful for the audience that we're dealing with and for the kind of measures that we're dealing with as well. So the third measure is rather grandly called MultiCriteria decision analysis. And with MCDA, you don't actually need to, you need to be aware of the different impacts are out there. There's more of a sort of discussion around the importance of those impacts. And the different measures can be characterized in that way using the available evidence. If it's quantitative, great. If it's not quantitative, then that can also be factored into the multi-criteria decision analysis techniques. And I think that that's a more positive way to proceed in TAPAS. The basic, I've realised just before I started that I've managed to leave out the slide that sort of spells this out in more detail, but the main issues, the main sort of approach with MCDA is, as I said, first identifying the effects of measures that you'll introduce, to quantify them where you can quantify them or describe them where you can't, and then to debate their relative importance to one another. And in that way, you can again sort of get an idea of the priority of one measure against another measure. It's a reasonably widely used technique, and methods for doing it are pretty well developed. It's had, in other fora, it's had a problem relative to, for example, cost benefit analysis, that it gives a more sort of nuanced result than CBA or cost effectiveness analysis. But I think in the case of TAPAS, I think a nuanced result is really what we should be aiming for, because of some of the measures, some of the benefits that we're that will be cropping up linked to the measures we could introduce to improve air quality in and around schools. I will finally just go back to this question of by when, and it's just to stress that, you know, we agree that air quality is a problem, so action's needed now. It's important to get the right measures in place, and I do accept that for some of those measures more research is needed before you could make really firm recommendations about adopting things. However, I think we could take a sort of stratification approach. There are some things that we could recommend very quickly, we know will be sort of beneficial, not least some of the issues I mentioned right at the beginning about bringing pollutants into school in cleaning products, building products, furnishings and furniture and so on. You know, if we can start to sort of stop that or recommend alternatives in those cases right at the outset, I think that's a useful thing to do. Another issue on relating to time is that it's important to consider future policy and technical developments. If we want to spend money wisely, we want to be focusing on measures that will be of long-term benefit. And to understand that properly, we need to, particularly with respect to outdoor air pollution, we need to have a good idea about what's happening with respect to existing air pollution improvement plans, and also climate policies, which will have a big effect on, for example, through electrification of cars, on emissions from the vehicle fleet. And other climate measures through reducing emissions from buildings and so on. So when prioritising measures, we can't take a static approach. We need to be looking forward as well as considering what's around us in the present time. And that's the end of it. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much for that very interesting talk. We've had quite a few questions in the chat.
Okay.
And of course, if you're listening, feel free to put extra questions in the chat. So the first question was whether you've seen a cost curve for tackling air pollution in UK schools, and whether anyone is really doing that work.
I've not seen that work being done. I'm pretty sure it's been done for greenhouse gases, but that, yeah, slightly separate issue to the one that we're dealing with here, specifically linked to air quality in schools. Now, I've not seen any cost curves on that. If anyone's aware of one, then please let me know.
So another question, I guess it's sort of same question with Sophie, whether there are any examples of cost curves based on schools, colleges. So I guess that's more generally and not UK focused, but I guess your answer is the same. I had a question which was, you sort of talked about how it's important to take a broad view of the benefits of different actions. And I wondered how you balance that with different kind of groups that have distinct interests. Like one of the things that I've been told recently is that teachers and schools are far more interested in exam results than they are in, say, energy conservation or climate change. Like they care about those things, but they really care about the results of exams. Yeah, how do you balance those two things?
I think it's important to understand what's driving the teachers. So the fact that they've expressed that view, which isn't a surprising view, you know, that is what they are there to do in many ways, you know, as well as hopefully turning out sort of well-rounded individuals, you know, part of that will be reflected in the exam results. Like I say, I mean, I think it's just part of that set of, you know, there's quite a wide range of benefits that are out there. If we focus on one thing in particular, be it you know, CO2 in classrooms or whatever, then you know there's a risk that we're missing other things, other benefits that are out there, and you know, the direct relationship of a measurement of pollution levels to the reasons that kids go to school won't be apparent to everyone. So I think it's useful to sort of, yeah, look rather more widely. I think those, I mean, this is one reason I was really interested in those papers on chess players and their performance, and you know, the papers concerned deal with yeah, serious chess tournaments. So this isn't so people just off the street sitting down having a game of chess. This is people who have actually come some way and are rather good at chess. And their performance being affected by air pollution is something I hadn't imagined in 100 years before I'd seen those papers. So I think yeah, when I talk about opening out the view of the benefits that you know, might be of interest, I think, yeah, that there are things like that, I think, that might actually have some resonance with teachers and bring them more on board with the whole with the process than otherwise might be in some cases. I mean, I'm sure many teachers will be, you know, straight onto it and very, very keen at the outset. And we know that from the experience that, you know, various people have had in this area already. But it's bringing extra people on board that you know, I think makes it important to look at those extra benefits. And I think there are some quite simple things out there that are not that could be used. I'm pretty sure, for example, that yeah, there are records of asthma medication rates in schools. So understanding how they vary from schools with different levels of pollution, I think, would be a useful input to the analysis. And yeah, again, that is something I think the teachers can relate to. So,
so we've got like 3 more questions. So one is, do MACs reflect macroeconomic effects or only microeconomic? So for example, do they include the multiplier effect in an economy?
They can do, they normally don't. So yeah, they are, like I said, you know, I think, yeah, they're certainly useful as the first ranking of what gives you the biggest bang for your buck, as it were. But they do have their limitations. You know, one of which, as I mentioned, was this very one-dimensional view of what the benefits of actions are.
So also, how do we deal with affordability? So even if we pick the most cost-effective measures, maybe these are still not actually affordable for schools. Do you think that's the case, or are there sort of easy wins?
I think there are some easy wins. I mean, particularly a lot of the work I deal with is on chemicals policy, and yeah, that does bring up some easy wins in terms of actually knowing what is in the products that you're bringing into schools, and ruling out some products in favour of others simply because of what's in them. And in some cases, you know, the better product might actually be cheaper, so you know, that gets around the affordability issue from the outset. I think thinking about affordability more generally, and in the Focus Area 2 meeting either last week or the week before, it was interesting talking about the specific systems going into schools, and yeah, these things weren't cheap. So I'm pretty sure certainly the schools I've been involved with wouldn't be able to afford those systems. I think the key there is in having a range of options that are available, so that people can sort of pick according to their budget. I mean, it does throw up some problems in that, if the person making the decision on what money should be spent on isn't actually interested in the issue, they might just opt for a cheaper option just to keep people quiet. But I don't really think there's any way around that. You need to come up with a sort of a range of options. I think in some cases also there's an issue of who's actually responsible for the pollution problem in the first place.
So related question to that comment. You mentioned working with government. How do we get the government to understand this as a key issue when looking at spend allocation and policy development?
I think part of that is flagging up some of the basic issues, such as the number of schools that are in areas where pollution levels exceed either the statutory guidelines or the World Health Organization's guideline values, which will be changed later this year. I think that the new values being published by WHO in the second week of July is the current plan, and they're likely to be a significant reduction on the previous version. So sorry, I've lost track of the initial question.
Yeah, that was sort of how do we get government to pay attention? Yeah, that makes sense. And just one last question. So you've outlined the reasons for focusing on schools. Do you think there should be more of a targeted focus on early years or primary settings?
It would seem, well, not being medically trained, take this as you will, but yeah, it would seem to me that those groups are likely to be more sensitive than groups than older children, on average anyway. So it would seem to me that a targeted focus on those groups sounds sensible. It would be good to get some medical input on that, proper medical knowledge rather than mine. I think for TAPAS, where it is at the moment, I think there is a constraint in terms of focusing on schools that are most likely to be taking up measures and get involved in this. And that might not necessarily be the early years and primary settings right now. It might be a couple of years down the line, but I think there's some preparatory work to be done that is more likely to be taken by schools with older children. Feel free to disagree with me on that, but yeah, that is my sort of gut feeling about what we can do at the moment. And once these lessons have been learned, they can be disseminated, and I think perhaps that is then the time to focus on the early years primary settings. But like I say, if anyone wants to disagree, please do.
Well, thank you very much. So we've got another seminar next week. Marty van Tongeren, Thomas Bannon and Larissa Rockford, and they'll be talking about air quality in schools, links to cognitive function, and the impact of air purifiers. And there's a link in the chat if you'd like to sign up straight away. Okay, well, thank you all very much for attending, and thank you, Mike, for speaking.
Okay, thank you.